This is a port in Jamaica's capital city of Kingston. It's called the Kingston Freeport Terminal. Not only is it the most important shipping hub for import and export in Jamaica, but it's the number one hub in the entire Caribbean region. The thing is, this port wasn't operated by Jamaica. Those rights were part owned by France, who sold their shares, and now it's operated by this country, China. So is Jamaica's main highway and land alongside it. So is one of its largest mines and its largest sugar company. It's also spent billions and billions of dollars investing in oil refineries, hospitals, sports stadiums, police stations, luxury hotels, residential projects, and even a tower named after Usain Bolt. All these things aren't just financed by Chinese banks, but constructed with Chinese equipment, operated by Chinese management, and built with Chinese labor and technicians. So how and why did China, a country with 1 billion people and one of the largest economies in the world, come to own all this stuff on this small island in the middle of the Caribbean, nearly 9,000 miles away? And is this, as some people suggest, a debt trap?
Debt trap. Debt traps.
Debt trap.
Debt trap diplomacy.
Or a new form of colonization with a new face? Now, before we get into this topic, you should know that Jamaica has a long-tenured Jamaican Chinese community, a community that has contributed a great deal to modern-day Jamaica. This emerged largely as a result of indentured labourers who were shipped to the island by British colonial powers, who needed cheap labour to fill the void left behind by the abolition of slavery. The descendants of those people have settled in Jamaica as their home. What we are talking about here is not about those people. It's about the Chinese state, who in the last few decades have been growing their reach, not just in Jamaica, but the Caribbean, Africa, and well, just about everywhere else in the world. So what could China possibly want with this small island nation of 3 million people? Well, being one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and perhaps soon to be the number one, with a population of nearly 1.5 billion people comes with many issues. These billion people need houses, they need schools, they need hospitals, shops, offices, which all need resources to be built. They need transport to get to all these places, and all this requires natural resources to build and sustain them. And all these things, well, China doesn't actually have enough of. Well, not enough for 1 billion people and counting. And Jamaica just so happens to have one of the highest concentrations of one of these natural resources in the world. It's called bauxite. To cut a long story short, bauxite is valuable because we can use it to make aluminum. Aluminum is incredibly useful because it's the base material used to make all manner of things like airplanes, trains and cars, to buildings and their cladding and windows, as well as home appliances like air conditioners and fridges, and even food packaging. In short, large developing countries like China need an ever-increasing amount of aluminum, and Jamaica has this and more. On the other side of this equation, you have Jamaica. Whilst Jamaica is a stunningly beautiful country with a massive global profile, it has been mired in poverty, national debt, and economic stagnation for decades. Jamaica's number one revenue earner for much of the 20th century and beyond has been tourism, and for many reasons, tourism sucks for development. The profits are concentrated in a few, often international-owned baskets. In addition to this, it's seasonal, so it can't be counted on all year. And to top it all off, as we saw in the last few years, it can be turned off overnight. For years, people in Jamaica have wanted better infrastructure in the country, better roads, better schools, better hospitals, and enter China. China needs resources, Jamaica needs investment. It sounds like a perfect match. Jamaica for the longest time has needed to diversify its economic income base because for its old quote-unquote partners, i.e. Europe and the US, the relationship has been completely one-sided, tracing back all the way to the transatlantic slave trade that reaped billions of dollars from the Caribbean region with zero benefit to the people who labored for those profits. The British who conquered the Spanish and controlled Jamaica throughout that time built many grand estates, roads, government buildings, schools, hospitals and market towns, but these were all to serve their colonial needs, and as soon as the independence movement grew and independence was granted in 1962, these were mainly left to deteriorate. After this, in the 1970s, when Jamaica and the Caribbean entered into relations with the newest superpower of that time, the United States, this relationship was much the same, of America's imperial neoliberal policies, led by the World Bank's International Development Association and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Loans were given to poor countries like Jamaica, but these came with major strings attached. The loans, otherwise known as structural adjustment programs, demanded that Jamaica, the Caribbean, and Latin American countries open up their economies through flat tax rates, privatization, the selling of national assets, and deregulation. These were stark opposite to the socialist-facing societies that were growing in the Caribbean. What's worse is that if these conditions weren't accepted by the ruling party, violent regime change and instability initiated by American forces could follow. Coupled with unforeseeable events like global oil crises and financial crashes, these increased the price of imports to the country, and Jamaica was in little position to pay off its debts. All this value left Jamaica, and yet the country had little to show for it. Any discussions of reparations had been limited, and Jamaica, like many other countries, are in the same condition they were before, but now arguably with higher rates of inequality, crime and poverty. Not to suggest that government corruption didn't happen during this time, but as the Center for Economic and Policy Research and others suggest, Jamaica's economic and social progress has suffered considerably from the burden of an unsustainable debt and that policies implemented under the auspices of the IMF have also damaged Jamaica's recent and current economic progress. International debt has crippled Jamaica, and this prevents national spending in areas like education, healthcare, and employment, and these all add to poverty and crime. Ironically now, the US is not a fan of China's new moves into the Caribbean. Former ambassador to Jamaica, Donald Tapia, and the Trump administration were frequent vocal critics of China's growing role in Jamaica, and Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak recently stated that China poses an epoch-defining challenge to the security of the UK and the wider world. These claims, however, seem hypocritical. The US and Europe haven't made development in the Caribbean a priority at all. You could even say the opposite if you look at France and the US and Haiti. With the centuries of involvement and the head start they've had in the Caribbean region, the West has done relatively little to improve the lives of the everyday Jamaican and the Caribbean person. Ironically, also at the start of China's ascendancy, before it was a major power today, the West was more than happy to be its partner. Now the Caribbean is doing it, it's a problem. Jamaica needs a new array of trading partners, and who else is stepping up except China? China's trade in the region has remained stable and even grown over the last decade. On its current path, Latin American, Caribbean, and China trade is expected to exceed $700 billion by 2035, more than twice as much as in 2020, and data suggests China will approach and could even surpass the US as the region's top trading partner. It's a fact. China is investing and it is building stuff, and the speed of completion and quality of output is noticeable to many people who commend China. Chinese state-owned Jiquan Iron and Steel Group, JISCO, acquired Alumnia Partners of Jamaica, aka Alpart, for $299 million US, which runs one of the country's major bauxite refineries. You also have the state-owned China's Pan-Caribbean Sugar Company, spending $156 million to own and revive the country's largest sugary primary production estates. Plus, there has been $1 billion invested by the Chinese into Jamaica's state-owned Petrodram oil refinery via Sino-Hydro, a Chinese state-owned hydropower engineering company. In addition to this, the China Development Bank and China Exim Bank, two Chinese state-owned banks, have provided the Jamaican government with nearly a dozen major loans. These loans were for the upgrade and construction of things like convention centers, sports stadiums, the country's first new hospital since 1970, as well as shoreline reconstruction and numerous housing and infrastructure development projects. This was all investment that was needed by Jamaica, and the US and Britain seemingly were not offering to do it. One of the prime cases of this investment that you're likely to see if you visit Jamaica is the North-South Highway 2000, which runs from the tourist hotspot of Ocho Rios to the capital city of Kingston. The project was first proposed all the way back in the 1970s and stalled for many years, but was completed in a matter of years by CHEC, the Chinese Harbour Engineering Company, a major Chinese engineering company who invested over $700 million into the project. Without the highway, this journey can be a long, bumpy journey up the winding hills and down the valleys, and now there is a shiny new highway which cuts down the travel time between the two cities. That being said, the highway is not free to travel on for the Jamaican public. There are tolls. The revenue generated from these tolls is used to cover the operating costs of the highway, and the cost of financing the construction of it will have to be paid back over the course of the next 50 years. So you could deduce that the money essentially goes to the Chinese firms who built it, and maybe you think this is fair. Add to this as another concession of the deal, the CHEC received 1,200 acres of land alongside the highway for development of residential and commercial projects. This still seems to be a microcosm of the fact that China is not a charity, and it's not helping countries out like Jamaica out of the goodness of its heart. China does need natural resources, but there's more to it than that. Economic growth has started to taper in China. This seems natural given the unprecedented hypergrowth it's seen in the last few decades. Therefore, China needs to guarantee future growth, jobs, and prosperity to keep people happy back home. So it's making strategic moves around the world to ensure this. Investing into emerging economies overseas and making moves today that will carry favor with international governments like Jamaica tomorrow. In a 2019 visit to China, current Jamaican Prime Minister Andrew Holness was reported as saying that Jamaica was seeking further investment from China in order to develop special economic zones and ports, with Jamaica's Global Logistics Hub initiative becoming an essential component of China's Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is the public brand of China's expansion around the world. Most of this investment comes in the form of concessional government-to-government loans with low interest rates well below market levels, some as low as 2%, with the conditions kept secret, making them attractive to highly indebted, economically challenged Caribbean countries. This BRI, however, has been accused of promoting debt trap diplomacy, which is a way of trapping another nation into a cycle of debt. This is a sure way for the lender to have a constant money earner for years and years to come, as interest rates hamper the repaying of loans. To simplify debt trap diplomacy, put it like this: a lender country, like China, offers loans to borrower countries, often with low interest rates and long repayment periods to fund infrastructure projects such as roads, ports, and power plants. The borrower country may not have the resources or financial stability to repay the loans and may find itself in debt to the lender country. The lender country may use the debt as leverage to gain economic or political influence over the borrower country. For example, it may demand ownership or control over strategic assets or push for policy changes that benefit the lender country. The borrower country may become increasingly reliant on the lender country for further loans, creating a cycle of debt, and many people believe this is a new form of colonization, the same that decimated the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. A cautionary tale of Chinese loans is in Sri Lanka. Here, the government could not repay its debt for the construction of one of its shipping ports called Hambantota. In a 2017 deal between the Sri Lankan government and China Merchant Ports Holding, a Chinese logistics company, it was agreed that the Chinese firm would now run the $1.5 billion port on a 99-year lease, or owning it for a century depending on how you look at it. People question whether the same thing could happen in the Caribbean and Jamaica. But was this a dedicated debt trap by China, or was it actually mismanagement of debt and corruption from Sri Lankan leaders? Many other scholars suggest that the idea of debt trap is in fact a myth. Deborah Boutigam, a professor of international development at America's Johns Hopkins University, in her book Will Africa Feed China, agrees that Chinese investment in countries is about securing access to national resources like Jamaica's bauxite, but it is not aimed at trapping countries in debt. The owning of assets by China is a result of events, but not the reason that they happened. Also, is it China's fault when governments they lend to mismanage debt? Basically, proof of the debt trap is really hard to prove. The thing is, all companies in China, whether they are officially state-owned or not, need ties to the CCP. And so the moves these companies make all globally benefit China in some shape or form. When China gives financial support to countries like Jamaica and wins these infrastructure projects, there too are strings attached, but nothing seemingly close to the things that Europe and the US demanded. What it does mean often is the use of majority Chinese contractors, Chinese designers, architects, technicians, and laborers. And some would say this is completely fair. What doesn't seem fair is the allegation of corruption that lead to the awarding of these contracts, and allegations of Chinese companies skating around labor and tax laws to cut costs. If the playing field for Jamaican companies or workers is not fair, again, this leaves the regular Jamaican person without any benefit from all this investment. If we look at Chinese investment in Africa as an example, Susheng Zhao, director of the University of Denver's Center for China-US Cooperation, explains, Chinese companies have tended to keep local hiring to a minimum, preferring instead to bring cheap labor from China. He gives Central African country Angola as an example, where Chinese companies hire 70 to 80% of their labor force directly from China. So it can be seen, China's foreign investment may not actually be meant to provide meaningful employment to locals. Also, in 2009, a researcher in China proposed before the National Congress that sending Chinese laborers to Africa could provide about 100 million jobs for China and solve their growing unemployment problem. Unions supporting Jamaican workers have also now emerged. They suggest that they have evidence showing overwhelmingly Chinese workers doing common laborers' work, and also that it is simply misleading that currently unemployed Jamaican craftsmen are not at least as qualified to do the task that Chinese workers are being brought over to do. Furthermore, owners of Jamaican construction businesses have also criticized the government for providing tax waivers and import concessions for Chinese companies, putting local firms at a disadvantage when bidding for contracts. That being said, Jamaican officials have continually stated that ratios between foreign and local workers would continue to be negotiated. As more projects happen over the years, this will be seen. Jobs created are better than no jobs created, and whilst China is commended for creating jobs in the absence of other major powers doing nothing, these jobs are criticized for a number of reasons. Like many examples in Africa, labor forces have started protesting against poor working conditions. In one example, workers of CHEC, the same company who built the highway, allege that they do not receive pay slips, are not paid for overtime work, and are not allowed sick leave. In another, workers claim protective gear they were given by CHE was subpar and led to injuries. So, is Jamaica prioritizing pleasing Chinese businesses over securing meaningful employment for local Jamaicans? That is the question. And with China reaping so much benefit from its position in Jamaica, is this a shiny 21st century version of colonization or world domination dressed in suits with favorable loans and payoffs in the form of slick roads and new buildings? That being said, you can argue the goal seems to be the same as America and Europe's was, to open up the economy and to benefit those who are in power and not the everyday people. So is anything really different? Maybe. But it's possible there's a different side to the story. China is a global superpower, and it's playing a superpower game. And perhaps Jamaica is just a small chess piece in its global game. In the new Cold War, East versus West, communism versus capitalism, China's position in the Caribbean can be looked at through a geopolitical lens, especially with the Caribbean's proximity to America. Jamaica's location just south of Cuba echoes the Cold War and the Soviet Union's favoritism towards the country as a backdoor to America. Many see Chinese moves into Jamaica as a similar geopolitical move. China has developed military ties to a varying degree with countries such as Jamaica since 2010. This includes, amongst other things, providing military aid to Jamaica in the form of millions of dollars. Some political analysts view Chinese military activities in the Caribbean as counter to US naval activities in the South China Seas, as well as its military provisions to Taiwan. And speaking of Taiwan, China and Taiwan have a deep-rooted tension. This dispute between China and Taiwan basically centers around whether Taiwan should be considered an independent country or part of China. With China making so many friends around the world, it could be supposed they are buying favor to their position on this topic. That being said, Jamaica has remained relatively pro-US in its foreign policy. This all could simply be overstating things, and again, it could all be about money. Jamaica's location, with the port of Kingston being a top 10 shipping hub in the entire Latin American and Caribbean region, provides an excellent gateway for the entire Asian region to access natural resources and for Caribbean markets to access affordable Asian goods. Either way, by controlling 100% of Jamaica's largest shipping port for at least the next few decades, arguably one of the most important assets any country has, China has a say in all of this. An official government release said that the Jamaican government would not be taking on further Chinese debt, but that future infrastructure projects would take the form of joint venture partnerships, public-private partnerships, or private sector transactions between Jamaican and Chinese firms. All these, though, you imagine, would be favorable to China in some shape or form. So, does China own Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean? Well, not exactly. China only makes up less than 5% of Jamaica's total debt portfolio. Furthermore, proof of debt traps can certainly be argued, but they aren't totally conclusive either. Of course, this can change in the future, but it seems that accusations of neocolonialism come mainly from Western powers, i.e. US and Europe, that have been doing much worse in the Caribbean for centuries and for which the everyday people of the Caribbean have seen no tangible benefit. If you feel that China is colonizing Jamaica, then by that same argument, China is colonizing the rest of the world anyway. What is clear, however, is that China is not doing charity work. It's doing what all countries do, especially superpowers, which is to look out for itself, and this includes, if reports are to be believed, initiating or overlooking environmental damage, poor working conditions, and corruption from local politicians allegedly looking to line their own pockets. All these accusations and allegations, though, can be lobbied at the West as well. Privatization and selling of assets happens everywhere in the world. Asking if China owns Jamaica might be the same as asking if China owns England, or if Qatar owns France. China has the money, but it's not overtly forcing anyone to accept it, and for every buyer, there has to be a seller. With that said, the sheer scale of funds China can offer can of course sway small Caribbean countries. It's easy to suggest China is some new colonial boogeyman, but is it helping to overthrow governments by funding juntas and militias, or rigging elections? Is it overtly threatening the Caribbean to engage in any major lateral policy change that would benefit China? Or is it threatening to cut off aid? China isn't going to voluntarily invest and then not look to maximize that investment. Nobody would. This might mean overhiring a Chinese workforce, for example. For Jamaican people to be better represented and benefit from Chinese investment, local governments need to be more accountable, not just China or its investors. Whether this accountability is happening is for Jamaicans who live and work in the country every day to say. Managing development is tricky. There's no handbook or manual. There's no guide, and every country is so different it's tough for any country to completely follow another successful model. The Caribbean is looking for options to support economic growth, and this is where China comes in. Though it stands to question, if the moves made by those in positions of power don't benefit the people of the country, then who really wins? If you agree or disagree with anything in this video, please feel free to comment below. Thanks, like the video and subscribe and share.